back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. I'm your host, Chris Hayat. On this episode, I'm joined by Stephanie Shapiro, the eldest granddaughter of 4 Holocaust survivors. Stephanie grew up in Toronto with a deep connection to her family history. After high school, she started her education to become a teacher, but eventually decided she'd be more fulfilled working in human resources. After completing a postgraduate degree, she went to work in HR for Transport Canada. After 8 years of the federal government, she decided to look for the next challenge. She found it as the chief operating officer of the charity Together We Stand. Established by Stephanie's family, Together We Stand is solely focused on supporting military families in Canada. Before we get to our guests, a quick word from our podcast partner, Grizzly Woods, a veteran-owned small business that produces fine natural maple syrup and wildflower honey.
Introducing Grizzly Woods, a proud generational and veteran-owned maple syrup and honey producer nestled in the heart of Ottawa. Our exquisite maple syrup comes in various sizes and color grades, perfect for every taste. Savor the richness of our locally sourced honey products. Visit grizzlywoods.ca or find us on Facebook for product info and updates. Taste the tradition at Grizzly Woods, where nature's sweetness meets craftsmanship.
And now, my friends, here's my conversation with Stephanie Shapiro. Hey, Steph, thanks for being on the podcast, and appreciate you. No, you didn't come up here just for this, up to Ottawa, through the snow and the ice for the podcast, but hey, it's great that you made the journey up and taking the time today to be on the show.
Only for this podcast would I travel through an ice storm.
I am going to clip that and use that endlessly on loop for advertising purposes. I guess the hallmark of the show, at least in terms of kicking things off when talking with people, is always about families. And I really didn't know anything about you before we started down this sort of road of doing the podcast, and you've got a unique family history, and one that I think is really interesting in a lot of ways. Maybe we can just start on the maternal side of your family and kind of walk through, each grandparent and sort of a little bit about their lives and how they came to Canada. So maybe whether your grandmother or your grandfather on your mom's side, why don't we start there?
My grandparents on my mother's side were both from Poland. And my grandmother was a small child as World War II was breaking out. My grandfather was a lot older. And it's funny, after speaking, I did a little bit more digging into their history because I've spent a lot of time speaking about my father's parents, but not as much time speaking to my mother's parents because they were significantly older as I was growing up. So we didn't have those conversations. My grandmother's parents and siblings and her during World War II were sent to Siberia to work at a work camp. They were considered political prisoners at the time. And my grandmother at a very early age, about the age of 12, learned that if she was going to help her family survive, she was going to be working on behalf of her family. Her parents were older, not as capable, and so she was sort of responsible for helping her 2 younger siblings survive and keeping her family going. My grandfather, on the other hand, was part of the army, and in Poland before the war, and ultimately ended up in jail. Spent some time in prison, but because he looked more Polish than he did Jewish, he managed to fake his identity and get released from prison, and spent his time after that smuggling Jews out of the country, up to and including after the war. When the war was over and my grandmother's family was released from the work camp, they all went back to Poland, but Poland wasn't readily accepting the Jewish community after the war. They didn't want them there, but they also didn't want them to leave. So they closed the borders.
Okay.
And so my grandfather was responsible for smuggling Jews out of the country. And the last family he smuggled out was my grandmother's family, where they went into Germany to a displaced persons camp.
Now, what was your grandfather doing that allowed him to simultaneously smuggle Jews out of the country. So he gets out of prison, he conceals his identity, and so what's his job that allows him to sort of continue to do this?
He flew under the radar. He just survived. He would hide in families' homes. He would, individuals that believed in what he was doing. It was almost the equivalent of like an underground railroad, where he had a support system where they were all determined to smuggle as many individuals out of the country as possible. So he was a wanted individual during the war.
Did you ever have a chance to talk to him? You said he was a fair bit older.
No, we never had that conversation. And my grandmother, I was 14 when he passed. Unlike my mother's, my father's mother is still alive.
Okay.
And she would readily share her story. She was much more open about her experiences, whereas my grandfather was much more closed off. We didn't talk about these things. And my grandmother, who was significantly younger, by the time that he passed and I started to evolve into a bit more of an adult, she was showing early signs of dementia. So we didn't have the opportunity to speak about it. So any stories that I know come from my mother and her sister.
What was your mother and her sister sort of experience then growing up in that household then? You've got two people who have got these incredibly traumatic experiences from an early age.
Very different from the other side of the family somehow. My mother and her sister are 9 years apart. So my aunt was born in the displaced persons camp in Germany. And then they ultimately came to Canada. My mother was born 9 years later and grew up pretty much a single child because, my mother was still very, very young by the time my aunt got married and had her first child. Their parents weren't around that much because when they came to Canada, they had no choice but to get to work and to work as much as possible. So for the first years of their time in Canada, they ran a dry cleaning store in what was, I want to say downtown Toronto, but it was, there was nothing north of where they were at the time. And so they ran a dry cleaning store and then ultimately moved to run a children's store. But I know my mom would talk about her upbringing being quite lonely because she just sort of had to rely on herself. She was a latchkey kid. She was home alone quite often because her parents were working to keep food on their table.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and how specifically on the latchkey kids and the like, and how this, I guess, generationally over many, many years, these sort of things go in cycles, right? And you become a latchkey kid, and then what you sort of missed from your parents, you try to give that to your children, and then what they are missing from their parents, and that things can then just sort of go full circle back to a point where there's a correction. It's like, well, there's too much sort of, whether it be whatever your term might be, helicopter, snowplow. We need to give them, a little bit more autonomy. We need to allow them to fail, to make mistakes, right? And then you can see how it then sort of draws itself back, and then the cycle starts all over again.
We even see that in my own family. It's so funny that you say that because I never thought about it going in cycles. But my mom grew up completely by herself, raising herself. And as a result, she was a stay-at-home mom for my sister and I because she never wanted us to experience that. And yet growing up, I never understood from my mother, I'm like, you just want to raise us? Like, that doesn't seem interesting enough, even though she was completely fulfilled with that.
Right.
And it was so important in her soul to be there and be present for her kids. And so I kind of almost course corrected where I'm working quite a fair bit and I'm not always home for my kids. So it absolutely, I didn't feel I needed my kids to see more of a balance.
Right.
That I can be home, but I can also have a career.
Yeah.
Whereas the two generations before, it was extreme opposites.
Yeah, I'll have to put the book in the show notes. It was Al Luft, who was on the podcast earlier. We had this conversation last week, and we were talking about this exact issue, and he was the one who pointed this out to me in a book. So I'll have to get the title of that book and put it in the show notes. So that's on your mom's side. How about your dad's side then? Grandparents, paternal grandparents?
Both small children when World War II broke out, and very different paths. So my grandfather's family sort of saw the writing on the wall in terms of what was going on. My grandfather was born in what was Czechoslovakia and is now the Czech Republic. He came from a very well-off family, a very large family. His mother and father both had either 12 or 13 brothers and sisters in a very, very close-knit community. And they saw the writing on the wall, and they decided they had to get out before the borders were closed. So my grandfather and his nuclear family managed to get out and come to Canada the day before the borders closed. And so the rest of their family ended up perishing in the Holocaust. So they came to the country. You had to come to the country as a farmer. That was one of the only ways you can get in. And as a result, my family became dairy farmers. And my uncle still owns a dairy farm today. So
really?
And his kids are running it as well.
In and around the same area?
They were in Hamilton, and now they're more in the GTA.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so they got lucky, with the exception of the rest of their family perishing, but their nuclear family got very lucky. My grandmother's family was not nearly as lucky, much more sort of harrowing tale. She was about 8 years old when her mother, they were living in the ghetto at this point. My grandmother was born in the Ukraine, so it's really interesting to see what's happening there now.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that there is a saving grace to the fact that she has dementia, because I imagine that what is going on there now would be entirely triggering to her. Her mother was picked up by the Nazis in a truck when she was out getting bread, and they never saw her again. My great-grandfather realized that in order for his daughter to survive, he needed to start making some plans. He was taken to a work camp, smuggled her into the work camp, didn't want anybody to know that he had a child, so they didn't go looking for her. And ultimately, she spent months living in the wardrobe in his room. So she has terrible claustrophobia now and huge trauma from that. And the only time she was allowed out was when it was dark out, and he would come back to the room. So she spent about 18 hours a day in a wardrobe. After that, he realized somebody had seen her in a window, and he realized it wasn't going to be very safe. So he contacted a non-Jewish friend who had a family of his own and said, "Would you be willing to hide my daughter?" And this man put his entire family's livelihood at risk when he said yes. So she lived with this family. There was a teenage daughter and a husband and wife. She lived with them in secret for a while. Ultimately, one day, the Nazis came looking for her because people heard word that she was hiding. And the teenager was upstairs with my grandmother and pushed her out of a second-story window to hide her because the Nazis were coming upstairs. And my grandmother ran to an outhouse and hid in the outhouse until the coast was clear. They realized that it was not safe for her there anymore. And ultimately, she ended up living with a priest and getting baptized, pretending that she was his niece. And she stayed there for the remainder of the war until her mother's sister came to retrieve her because her parents had both died.
Have you, your family, your mom or your dad, ever had any desire or visited some of these locations where your grandparents were?
Yeah, I was really lucky. When I was about 16 or 17 years old, my parents, my sister and I took a trip back to what we called a trip back to our roots. With that side of the family, we went to the Czech Republic to see where my grandfather had grown up, and what a different experience it was than visiting where my grandmother was. So we went to visit where he was from. He was born right outside of Prague, so we got to really experience the beauty of Prague. We went to visit some, cousin, and relived some of the stories of his childhood, and so that was really lovely. On the other hand, then we traveled to Poland and the Ukraine to see where my grandmother was from. Some of the villages actually where she was from and where she had traveled haven't evolved all that much further. Really? It almost felt like we were going back in time. There were still homes with outhouses, no running water. So that was really interesting. But one story that stands out the most to me is we managed to track down the location of the work camp where my grandmother's father had been taken and where she had been hiding for several months. And we went into this building. It was this abandoned building. And we were walking through the hallway, and she was sort of counting doors, counting rooms to try to remember where she was. And we found the door, and she said, I think it was this room. The door was locked, and so my father, being my father, said, let's take a peek inside, and broke down the door. And to my grandmother's horror, the wardrobe was still standing there.
Really?
And she had, I have goosebumps thinking about it. And we have it on video back in the day where we had, video cameras over our shoulders the size of a suitcase. But she had the most traumatic response. And I know for a fact she had a really difficult time sleeping the rest of that trip, because I think she didn't anticipate seeing that.
How was she up to that point? Like, how was she managing the reliving of this until that point?
I mean, my grandmother came to Canada. She believed that education was life. So first and foremost, when she was 50 years old, she went back to school and got her university education.
Awesome.
So she got her degree, and she believed that in order for the Holocaust to not happen again, it was the survivors' responsibility to educate future generations and non-Jewish individuals about what kind of hatred and propaganda can lead to an atrocity like this. So she spent her life devoted to going into classrooms and speaking to young children about the Holocaust in a very child-friendly way. She was part of a national survivors board where they would bring survivors together every year and have conferences about how they could educate future generations. And she was a chaperone on a really interesting program that still exists today called March of the Living, where these are organized trips for younger high school Jewish children, younger Jewish adults, and in the adult version, it doesn't matter what your background is, where the survivors will actually take these trips back to concentration camps and tell them their own personal stories of being in these concentration camps, again, to educate, to bear witness to what happened. So she was one of the strongest people I've ever met. So it was almost, and she relived her story every day. But I think having the evidence and seeing in person where some of the trauma took place, where she had never been back before, really shook her.
Do you think her retelling the story, whether it be to school children, to family, do you think that was helpful for her, or do you think that she just thought that this is something so important that regardless of how I feel about it or the impact it has, I have to do it?
I think perhaps part of it was cathartic, but it wasn't healing, because she still woke up most nights with nightmares. She still had deep trauma that, especially her generation, they didn't navigate that trauma. They were able to talk about it, but they didn't delve deep into the impact it was having on them. Therapy wasn't a thing for my grandmother's generation. So I think it was more the latter, that she just felt it was so important to make sure that the next generations were safe, that it didn't matter the toll it took on her. She just had to do it.
All your family ends up in Canada. You talked briefly about one industry was dairy farming. What are the other sort of businesses that the family got into once they landed in Canada? After dabbling in a few different areas, my grandfather ultimately landed in the lumber industry with two other gentlemen, and started a very small lumber company outside of the GTA. And that started the family business. My father, from a very early age, would be 11 years old and sweeping up the warehouse and driving forklift. And so the family business of the lumber industry became ingrained in him. And so ultimately, by the time he was old enough and finished school, he helped take up the reins. And then his brother got into it, and then their brother-in-law got into it. And it was sort of part of this family legacy of a business that had been around for 50 plus years. So is that the lumber industry as in the entirety of the supply chain, from owning land, cutting trees, milling it, or was that taking the milled product and selling lumber into construction companies?
Yes, so they would buy from, they had a supplier, they would cut the wood into whatever their customer needed, and then supply it. But they imported, they exported, they turned it into. I'm really proud of them because it started from nothing. It turned into 5 different separate companies, 2 of which have now been bought by public companies. And I look at my father's success and the other family as well, where he started from nothing and ultimately helped shape the lives of hundreds of employees, because one of the, it says something about a company when your employees are there for 30 plus years and they don't want to leave, because even though it was growing, it was still a family business and family took care of their own.
I think those stories are so important because if nothing else, it just reminds people, and I think it's as applicable today as it was then, nobody's going to give you anything. So you need to chart your own path in life, and if you want something, then off you go and figure out a way to get to that goal. And I think, like you already mentioned, they went through a number of different businesses and then sort of landed on like this one stuck. It was that perseverance of saying, okay, so now we're going to build this out because seems to be working to allow us to achieve what we want to achieve.
Yeah, and what I loved so much about my father when it came to his business is that he was never threatened by anybody's growth. He wanted to promote that. He didn't stifle. He wanted to develop future leaders. And my favorite story, the most inspirational story, is he had an individual who walked into his building. He was 17 years old and living out of his car, and said, I need a job. And so my father said, okay, I'm going to put you in the warehouse and you're going to cut lumber. And he did that for a couple weeks, and he turned to my dad and he said, I want the next job. And what do I need to do to get there? And my dad said, be the best machine operator you can be, and then let's talk. And so he did. And he worked his way out of the Outback operations into the office, and now he's currently the president of the company.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so cool. Yeah, there is a real value in some patience too, right? Not just skipping from one thing to the next. One of the expressions they have in the military is mastering the basics, right? So I know you want that next job, that next promotion, great, but focus on, and it's okay to have a bit of an eye on the future. In fact, I think that's quite important. But focus on just being amazing at what you're doing right now. Be the best at where you are. Right? Be that example. Yeah. Whether it be, your timeliness, showing up, always delivering excellence, learning, being curious. There's a huge value to that that I'm not sure is necessarily aligns all the time with a modern
and brings
modern
tremendous
age.
Credibility to the next steps in your career, because if you have to lead others, for them to know that you've been there, you did that job, you excelled in that job, you know how to mentor them in that job. It has tremendous buy-in from individuals that you have to lead.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. It's so true that you're really setting the foundation for your future, and it may not seem like it at the time because time does move in slow motion on occasion, but it really will be a great foundation for future success, not just professional success, but personal success.
Absolutely.
And so that's the establishment of the family coming to Canada, either before, during, or after the Holocaust. So we got these businesses now that are set up. What were the lives of your parents like? You sort of got into how your mom's life was, and how was your dad's life sort of growing up?
My dad's life was difficult. Being the firstborn child of a Holocaust survivor, I don't know what you do with that. You have a mother who's so driven by, first of all, you have parents who are very, very traditional, where the man is very much the authoritarian and the wife dotes on the family. On the other hand, you have a mother who is successful in her own right, but doesn't know how to particularly emotionally connect with her kids in the way that perhaps they needed it. I know, my father growing up, they had very, very little, very, very strict parents, and he grew up with his own anxieties. And my grandmother's response to any anxiety that he would bring up was, well, at least you have parents. There was no acknowledgement of any of the hardships that he might be going through, because it was always a comparison back to her life. And the reality is that when you compare somebody born in Canada with the privileges that we live to somebody who survived the Holocaust, you're never going to win that argument.
Right.
So that was difficult growing up. And I think he tried his best to always make life easier, to not be the squeaky wheel. And I don't think it was the same for his brother and his sister growing up. I mean, to a certain degree, but I do think birth order plays a big role in that, because you always kind of experiment with your firstborn.
We talked about this previously, because I had not heard it before we chatted about the whether it be the responsibility or the expectations of the eldest child of a Holocaust survivor or the eldest grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, and the role that position in a family plays with your identity.
Oh, yeah. The fact that my grandparents, and again, we didn't speak that much about my mother's side of the family, but my grandmother's story defined our family. And certainly the responsibility weighs heavier to a certain degree on the firstborn, grandchild, firstborn child. But if you were to gather my father's sister and brother into the room, and all of my younger cousins and my sibling, all of us would talk about the fact that the Holocaust defined our lives, for better and for worse. For worse in terms of there are studies and there is evidence of generational trauma. I would imagine it's similar in the military community where we talk about generational trauma, but up to and including the way that our brains are formed. There's all these studies on cortisol levels where Holocaust survivors had significantly higher cortisol levels, which can cause tremendous mental health issues, and that gets passed down from generation to generation. So it's no coincidence that you do find a lot of mental health issues in the Jewish community, depending on where the grandparents were from and what they went through. But on the other side, on the flip side, this determination, this perseverance, and this love of our country, to say, how lucky are we that we survived? How lucky are we that we get to live the lives that we do, because we understand what the alternative looks like, and therefore it's our responsibility to continue what my grandmother was doing and continue to educate, continue to build relationships and friendships from those from other faiths, because misinformation, miseducation, xenophobia is usually the root evil of all of this. So how do we carry on that legacy, and how do we continue to make Canada better?
Did the shared experience of the Holocaust, was that sort of the defining factor of how maybe your grandparents chose who they socialized with as well? Was that sort of they formed communities around that shared experience?
It's funny that you asked that. Yes and no. So no, from the outset. It was individuals that they met in their community that they formed relationships with. They had really deep-rooted friendships with individuals they'd met when they came to Canada. But my grandmother spent so much time in the community of Holocaust survivors that also believed that education was key, that formed some of her deepest friendships as well. I don't think she was actively, when she came to Canada, she wasn't actively seeking other Holocaust survivors. I think she was almost looking to move on a little bit. But as she got older and as she formed her group of peers who sort of had the same values and the same mission, she developed some really deep friendships from that.
I'm trying to walk myself through how you make sure that those experiences are shared beyond the family. I mean, the survivors board that you talked about earlier is certainly very powerful, but when you start to lose the people who have that lived experience, but it's that difference between somebody who lived the experience, sharing their experience, and that number of generations removed that are recounting the story that they were told or the story they were told by the person who heard the story in the first place.
We're seeing that now because the tragic reality is that the generation of survivors is dwindling, and even those that still remain aren't necessarily capable, my grandmother included, of continuing to share their stories. So we need to rely on the information they did share with us at the time. I think there was a point where a lot of individuals who, that next generation, felt so compelled to continue the learning that they did a great job gathering as much information from their survivors as they did when they could. So we just opened up a Toronto-based Holocaust museum, and it's unbelievable. And now that Holocaust education is mandatory in the province of Ontario, we have a lot of schools visiting the museum, but it's videos of the survivors that were captured 15, 20 years ago when they were able to articulate their stories and recount their own history. And it's truly a museum of all the documents that would have been prominent in their survival. So if you look at if you go to that museum, you can see a lot of my grandmother's forged documents that have been donated to the museum. All of the very few remaining family photos and videos of her retelling her story. And they do that survivor after survivor after survivor. It's interesting because I think that regardless of your political beliefs about the country of Israel, the attack on October 7th really shook the entire global Jewish community to the point where my generation feels more compelled than ever before to share our grandparents' stories. I grew up privileged in this country and in this world because if you look at the course of Jewish history, my lifetime was the most peaceful for our community.
Right.
And to a certain degree, you take a little bit of that for granted because you just believe that people have moved on from those beliefs. And now that we see that perhaps that's not the case, my generation is determined to continue the work of our grandparents where maybe we didn't have the same passion as we did before because we thought it was a non-issue.
Right.
We thought that issue had really sort of in a sense resolved itself because of the work that our parents and our grandparents did before. Now that we're seeing that's not necessarily the case, we're ready to take up that challenge.
Yeah, we tend to default to hope a lot of times and think, oh, it's in the rearview mirror. That's wonderful. It's in the rearview mirror. We don't want to forget about it, but thank goodness we don't have to deal with it. Thank goodness my children aren't going to have to deal with this particular situation.
That's right. And even the mindset of generations, my grandmother would tell the story to her children and say, we need to educate because it could happen again.
Right.
Whereas my parents' generation, if you look at all of the material globally about the Holocaust, the common phrase is never again, as in we will make sure it never happens again. And now we sway over to our generation and we're coming back to it could happen again.
Where did your parents meet?
They met in Toronto in high school. My father was younger, and as my mother likes to say, she took pity on him because he was a wee little thing. I think he was wrestling in the under 100-pound category at the time, and my mother was a very beautiful woman. And somehow he won her over with his charming wit and personality. And she always said she saw the potential in him. And they have been married now for over 40 years. And to me, they are this really beautiful couple that you don't always get to see individuals that have been together for over 40 years truly still make each other happy. And they've gone through their own challenges, but they are the epitome of what it looks like to grow together as a couple. And while they make each other crazy, they would throw themselves in front of a bus for each other. And they're number one in each other's books all the time, even though they have very little in common and they very much live their own independent lives.
I always love hearing about couples that evolve together and like each other.
They really do like each other.
But liking each other is something I just think is so cool and so important.
We have a joke in our family because, my mother will poke fun at my father and say like, oh my God, he's insane. And I always say, I'm like, Mom, he's my father. I have no choice. You choose him.
That's right.
You continue to choose this.
Yeah.
So,
of everybody in the room here, you had a choice.
That's right.
The rest of us did not.
That's right. You actively choose this constantly.
You'd mentioned your mom was at home. Your dad was, building a business. So what was your childhood like then in that environment?
I came from a very strict household. Again, the traditional values of the father and the man was the authoritarian, and the mother was more sort of doting on the kids and the husband was very much my childhood. Now my mother has grown quite the voice and can tell my father what's what, so it's really funny to watch that. It took her until she was 50 years old to do that, but they're better for it. My father worked. I mean, he was present when he was present. And in those moments, he'd like to really engage meaningfully with us, but he wasn't around a lot. He worked 6 days a week. He traveled overseas constantly, and these were the days where we didn't have FaceTime and cell phones. And so if he went to China or to Dubai, before Dubai was even developed, for 3 weeks, we were lucky to, get once a week phone calls. So we grew up, very much being raised by my mother. My mother did everything. That's all we knew. I didn't know there was another life outside of that. That's just what our life was.
You've referred to a couple of sort of times generationally, like the household was strict. Mm-hmm. So what in your mind what was a strict household? My
father ran us like a business to a certain degree. He didn't know better. He was a bit of a control freak. So, every Sunday our rooms would be inspected, and children, unless he was engaging with us, children were meant to be seen and not heard. He had a very strict idea of how he wanted his children to behave. And I know we would have Friday nights, we typically had dinner together. It was maybe one of the only nights of the week that we all had family dinners together, and my sister had to sit, I always kind of sat properly, but my sister was all over the place, and my sister every night was told exactly how you have to sit at the table. So he was a bit of a drill sergeant. Okay. And you had to do what he wanted when he wanted and have fun in the way he wanted. Yet some of the most vulnerable times in my life, he was the person I could turn to have those emotional conversations. So it was this very sort of conflicting,
paradoxical in a way, isn't it?
It was very bizarre because to a certain degree, he was not very open to understanding what our needs were. Because it didn't matter what our needs were. He knew exactly how he wanted his house to be run. But in our most vulnerable moments, he could actually get very vulnerable with us. And I think that's why, instead of growing up resenting him, I grew up wanting to make him proud. Because to a certain degree, I always sort of wanted to be like him, even in the times where I didn't always like him.
Now, what is a teenager in a strict household who is also I guess you were the eldest grandchild?
Yes.
Of a Holocaust survivor?
Yes.
So what do you do for fun then? Or what were your interests in as a teenager?
I was lucky because my parents always pushed me to explore my interests. So I did a lot of musical theater. I would say I was a lot more stable as a younger child. As a teenager, I think I lost my way a little bit. I think at that point, that's the time where I started resenting the household I lived in. And my mom wasn't always available to have those emotional, vulnerable conversations, yet she was the one that was there all the time. So it felt a little bit lonely growing up. And my sister and I were very different. But as a teenager growing up, where you start to want that autonomy and you want that independence, my parents were reluctant to give it. So I had very strict curfews. If you didn't meet your curfew or if you didn't get a certain grade, you were kind of guilty until proven innocent. It wasn't the opposite.
Right.
So you were a bit on edge growing up, for sure. And the responsibility of promoting the Jewish religion and continuing that conversation was pushed on me at a very, very early age, probably earlier than I was emotionally ready to handle. I was given books to read, and granted, they were meant for children, the books that I was reading, but I was given books to read about the Holocaust and about Israel and about how World War II happened and what happened during World War II by the time I was 11 years old. And I don't think I was emotionally ready to understand the atrocities that happened. I grew up from the earliest age knowing that people killed my grandmother's parents, that my grandmother was an orphan, that my grandmother was hidden because the bad guys were coming to get her. And so I grew up right into adulthood where ingrained in me, I would walk into a new setting and I would immediately try to figure out where I was going to hide. It was just, I always had to have a strategy of how I was going to save myself and escape from what was coming, because that fear was ingrained in us. And I don't think as a child or as a teenager, you realize that's there and that's not normal.
What were your desires sort of post-high school, and vice, what were your parents' expectations for you post-secondary?
They never really articulated what profession I needed to be going into. And frankly, I wasn't really sure what I wanted. I always felt like I had a bit of a path carved out for me, but it wasn't necessarily by choice. I grew up babysitting all my younger cousins. And so my immediate thought was, well, I suppose I like children, so maybe I need to get into an industry where there's children. And I sort of had my sights set on becoming a school principal. And they were okay with that, because I think my parents' attitude was, whatever you do, just excel at it. Right? Just be your best. Get the best grades and try your hardest. And they were always pretty satisfied with that. I don't think they were ever trying to push me to become an engineer. That went by the wayside when they saw my science and math grades. So they knew who I was and who I wasn't. And it took me going down the path of learning to become a teacher to realize that managing children was not in my future if I ever wanted to have my own children and not hate them. Yeah. But I did always excel, and they were proud of that. I always felt compelled to. The way I measured myself was always how my father measured me, right or wrong, growing up. And so I never worked hard at school to make myself proud. I worked hard at school because I wanted to be able to call him at the end of the day and tell him the mark that I got. Right. I needed that external validation from him. And the good news is he gave it to me. He was a really proud parent. And I really, really appreciated that. But it took some time to realize that I had to start doing things for myself. And I think the path that I took originally was very much about how am I going to do right by my parents, versus my sister growing up, who was much more of a free spirit. And they allowed her to be more of a free spirit because I think they focused more of their sights on me. I was going to be the continuing generation of educating and growing the Jewish family. And my sister was always a bit more of a free spirit and took a very, very different path. My path was either planned by me or for me. I don't really know.
Yeah.
I think it was the appearance that it was planned by me, but it might have been planned for me, versus my sister who lived in Israel for a while, lived in Costa Rica for a while, went to massage therapy school. You know, she wasn't really sure where she wanted to go. And so she was allowed to explore all these different areas of life. And I always thought she was crazy. You know, to me, I always thought, I looked at that as failure because to me, I never saw her working towards a goal. But as I grew up and as I looked back on both of our journeys, and I remember articulating this to her, to me, what I realized was that she was brave because she was pushing herself out of her comfort zone. She was comfortable with the unknown, whereas I took the more comfortable, known path. So I always looked at her as being a very brave person.
Was that just the way your parents decided to parent, or is there any sort of linkage to the eldest child or grandchild of a Holocaust survivor and a level of expectation that's put onto that individual? Or
I think both. I think that it would be very interesting to go back and ask them now. I'm not sure that they were actively making those decisions in the moment. I think they saw who I was, they saw who she was, and so they had different expectations of both of us. They weren't going to take my sister and try to shove a square peg into a round hole. Versus me, you know, I fit the mold. And so therefore I was going to be shaped the way they believed I could be shaped.
When you decided that the only kids that you wanted to hang around with were going to be your kids and not other people's kids, so what was the next professional step that you made?
So I finished school. I did an undergrad in child psychology. And the funniest part, thank God my parents had a sense of humor. I wrote my thesis at school, and my thesis was all about how having one authoritarian parent and one permissive parent could lead to the next generation's anxieties in the ability to make decisions. Because on one hand, you had one parent telling you what to do, you had the other parent not having an opinion. And I kind of did a study on myself to see if I could validate my belief system. And I remember coming at the end of that school year and presenting the paper to them. They weren't sure what to make of it. But I decided that children weren't going to be in my path. And my father said, "So come work for me for a little while." And to me, that was comfortable. Again, taking the comfortable path because I had worked for him my whole life. My sister went to summer camp and went away and slept away and was gone for months at a time. And I was always reluctant to leave home. And so they always said to me, well, you're either leaving home or you're working. And so by 12 years old, I sort of followed the same path as my father and started sweeping the warehouse and filing and doing whatever I could to add value to the family business. So to me, taking the year to figure out what I wanted and going back to my family business was almost like coming home. Everybody that I worked with, I had grown up with.
Right.
And so it was safe. It was a safe environment to sort of explore myself. And serendipitously, he sent me into the human resources department. And I loved it. I really, really loved it. I loved understanding the behavior that drove an individual to success. I loved understanding how people could affect the bottom line. I loved understanding what could motivate individuals. I hated learning about health and safety. The more administrative side of things that were, part of the job. And so after about a year, I went back to school and did my postgraduate in human resources, and that led me down the path that I took.
So what was your first opportunity when you finished your postgrad to work in HR?
I was lucky enough to get into the co-op program at Seneca, where you would be placed you had to interview, but you would be placed into a job. And funny enough, I had moved out of my home, out of my parents' place because, there were some frictions and some tensions growing up. So it was healthier for me to move out of my house at a very early age. And it turned out that the job that I interviewed for was 2 blocks from where I was living.
Oh, really?
And I ended up working for the federal government at Transport Canada, and taking on a human resources position there and just growing, taking every opportunity and every advantage they gave me. I started off as a co-op student, filing paper. And of course, you come out of postgraduate school thinking you're going to conquer the world. And it's very humbling when they're like, great, go photocopy this file, because you feel like your skills are going to waste. But then you slowly start to realize that, coming back full circle, if I want to progress, I need to be the best photocopier that they've ever seen. And because I was so committed to being the best at whatever role I was put into, I was lucky to be in an environment where I was allowed to grow. And I was encouraged to grow.
I'm really interested by HR these days, mainly because of the recruiting and retention issue going on in the Canadian military. Mm-hmm. From your experience, is there a difference, or what are the differences between doing HR in the private sector or in the public sector in the federal government?
It's one of the reasons I finally got out. I was with the public sector for about 8 years, and I knew nothing. I didn't even know what I didn't know. And I loved what I was learning, but ultimately I felt like there was a part of me that wasn't living in the real world, because of the bureaucracy that was attached to every process and procedure that we had to follow. We would hire, I worked for, my clients were the civil aviation group, so I hired pilots and engineers, and we would have to run competitions. And keep in mind, I had come from the private sector at my dad's company before this, where, hiring was a 3-week process max.
Right.
And I was running these processes and these competitions that would sometimes go on for a year and a half. So it was almost to the point where a manager would come to me and say, I need position A. The competition, because of the very in-depth processes that we had to follow, could take up to a year and a half. And by the time we were ready to hire the individual, that need had grown into something else. So it almost felt like a dog chasing a car.
Right.
And it got really frustrating after a while. I didn't love the recruitment side of things. I loved training. I loved training managers on how to deal with employee relations issues, on how to performance manage their individuals. And I was really lucky to be given an opportunity to do a lot of that training. But ultimately, with the change of government that took place during my time, we were starting to see some cutbacks, and we were starting to see more shared services and less of the value added and more of the administrative function. And that's where I kind of felt like perhaps I'd learned everything I needed to learn here, because being a quote unquote bean counter for the rest of my life was not what I aspired to. I needed to be challenged, and I'd been challenged up to that point. And so it was a really difficult decision to make, because so many people were saying, you're getting out of a government job. It's cushy and you have all the benefits and you could be there for the rest of your life. And for some people, that was really aspirational. And for me, it kind of felt like I was facing death in the face. I'm like, this is going to be the rest of my life. I need to keep growing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of my takeaways from my time in the military, and my wife, right out of the gates when we met, I don't even know if we were dating. It might have been the first time that we met in Ottawa in the spring of '97. And we were, just getting to know each other. And she sort of asked a question about, how does this thing with postings work? Or, how does your HR system work? Because she was dealing with a lot of HR in her job. I said, well, we have a career manager that gets posted into this job, and then they're in it for, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, and they're off to something else. And she just sort of looked at me with this stare. Sorry, the person that manages your career is only in the job for 2 years? Are they a professional, HR? But no, they might be a they're going to be an engineer, or at the higher levels, it'll be some other sort of job. And she looks at you people really have a problem.
Right.
And I was, to be honest, I mean, I wasn't sort of dismissive in a mean way. I just said, well, she doesn't get it. Civilians, they don't get it. And of course, then as you move along, you start to realize, oh yeah, no, that 100%. We need a proper HR system. So the fact that, and this isn't meant to be pejorative to anybody who are in these jobs, but there's absolutely no reason why the head of military HR shouldn't be an HR professional.
I mean, it's an idea.
It's absolute insanity. Whether you're an infantry officer, a pilot, a ship driver, whatever it is. I mean, if you think about it this way, if you step into the cockpit of a plane, you want the person there who actually is a pilot, who knows what they're doing. So why do we not have somebody who is an HR professional in charge of military HR?
Well, I think it speaks, perhaps we're getting a bit of ahead, but I think it speaks to, when I think about the military, it speaks to operations versus the institution. And how operationally you have these men and women in uniform who are serving their country and are so unbelievably talented and resourceful and creative and service driven. But then you look at the institution itself, which is very similar to many government departments, and perhaps the right people aren't always the right people, because to your point, if somebody was in combat and exceeded in that, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go and run the department all that well, unless they receive the adequate training to do so.
Yeah, no, it boggles my mind. I mean, if I'm looking for a plumber, I'm going to go and read a bunch of reviews on plumbers. I'm not going to read a review on an electrician, hire an electrician to do a plumbing job.
Right, and hope for the best.
Yeah, this is the best electrician I've found. Hey, I need you to do this plumbing job for me. I mean, it's just it's bizarre. I mean, these are some of the things that when I hear talking to HR professionals, I think it is something that needs to be looked at in a really meaningful way, because it is going to contribute to better retention and better recruiting. But anyway, a little bit of a tangent there. But I am more and more interested in something my wife told me in 1997 I should be interested in. So, she's always ahead of the curve on me, for sure. So you left the public service then in HR, and did you carry on in the HR world?
To a certain degree. It actually worked out very interesting timing. I knew I had enough, and at the same time, my father was looking to retire from the lumber industry. And my father he was always the most interesting man to me. I mean, he was never happy he was never satisfied where he was. He always he's the most curious person I've ever met. He has an insatiable need to learn and to do more and to do as many interesting things as he can and have experiences. So, in the time where he was growing the lumber industry and being successful, he was climbing Mount Everest and climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, and because he always needed to push himself to see what his limits were. And he realized he'd stopped growing. He wasn't happy where he was anymore. And that he had aspirations that were no longer in the business world, in the more traditional sense of growing the family business. He really wanted to figure out how he could have an impact on Canada. Growing up, we have these deep-rooted values in our family, and it comes from my parents, of not taking our country for granted. And his motto as a Boy Scout, leaving the campground a little bit better than you found it. And so how was he going to do that? How could he get into more philanthropy? How could he get into more advocacy? How could he help shape generations, the next generation of the next political leaders, to become better versions of themselves? And so he left, and those were his personal aspirations. And he said, "This is what I'm looking to do. Do you want to come with me?" And so we started a family office together. And it just so happened, again, I don't know that at the time I believed in the values and what he wanted to do, but certainly over the years, he's molded me into his mini me, and I believe in all of these things. I drank the Kool-Aid. I got to learn a tremendous amount. I mean, first of all, he was managing our family's finances and teaching me a little bit about the investment world, which I found terribly boring, and I had zero math skills. But I felt that, somewhere along the lines in my own personal life, this has to be added value.
Yeah. So
I was willing to learn. And God bless him, he dumbed that down for me as much as he could so that I could kind of grasp the subject matter. But we really started to talk about what helping Canada could look like. And so, he was working with future political leaders and helping in municipal and provincial and federal campaigns. He was working in advocacy in terms of continuing his mother's work in the Jewish community.
Right.
And he always had an affinity for the military. And him and my mother always believed that one of the reasons that we get to live the life that we live here in Canada and have the safeties and securities that we have is because of our Canadian military, because of the work that our men and women in uniform do here and abroad. And so they always wanted to do something for the military to say thank you. And it was funny enough, it was my mother who had spent all these years raising her children alone, waiting for her husband to come home, who said, saying thank you to those in uniform is one thing, and I think it's a worthy cause. But when we look around the military philanthropic landscape, it seems that there's a lot of organizations out there that really are focusing on the member or the veteran. Is there anybody talking about the family, the children, the spouses, the parents of single-serving members, and talking about the sacrifices that they make? And she said, because I know I had to do a lot on my own, but the difference was we weren't moving constantly, and my husband wasn't getting shot at, with the exception of that one time. And so they determined that the focus of their philanthropy was going to be giving back to military families and honoring the work of military families.
Now, before we dive into the details of the charity that was established, I mean, how did they come to the conclusion about the role of the military in establishing Canada what it is today? Because I don't know how commonly held that is.
I think that, first of all, my father is an incredibly well-read individual and is a history buff. So I think he very much understood the role that Canada played in World War II, how Canada was established, the importance of having a strong military if we want to protect our borders. And I think that when you're born in a country that has never had to fight for your freedom on your own land, I think that generations become complacent. They take that for granted. And my father's history with his mother and his father and our family history made it so clear that we need to have protection. We need to have a strong military so that should anything happen, we are well protected.
Now, your parents make the decision to dedicate some of their philanthropic energy to a military charity, mm-hmm. and you outlined how the military family was something that you thought should be, or your parents thought should be, the focus. So how does one go about then establishing a charity and sort of getting the ball rolling to do good work? You
need some good lawyers. You need to figure out how to work with the CRA very quickly. But ultimately they hired someone they didn't even know what they wanted it to be yet, but they hired a president who had been involved in the charitable philanthropic community before, to kind of guide them through that process. So he took care of the branding, he took care of all the administrative, he took care of all the legal, and I think he made it pretty seamless for them so that they could just start giving money and start figuring out what they wanted it to look like.
Now, once you get the legal framework in place and you make sure that CRA is not going to have an aneurysm by what you're doing. So what's the first step then? Because, I mean, even if you have a real passion for military families, you've been a huge supporter of the military or veterans. I mean, most Canadians, it's still the outside looking into a very insular, in a lot of ways, organization. It has its own language. We live on our own communities a lot of times. So how do you break in to start being able to actually deliver the impacts and the effects?
So I think that a couple of different things. First of all, I'm not sure that they took the time to get to know their stakeholders in the way they should have. So they determined that they knew they wanted to say thank you to the families. And in order to say thank you to the families, they determined they were going to do that by the way of delivering care packages to those families who were experiencing a deployment in their family during the Christmas holidays. Now, how are they going to do that? Because to your point, how do they tap into that community, and where do they even find these families? And so I come back to, this is a very Stephanie's father story, but my father, looked at the institution, wasn't particularly threatened by it, and so he called the chief of the defense staff.
Why not? I'm not sure that's a terrible idea, to be honest.
I mean, he didn't know who to call, so he figured I'll call the guy at the top and see what happens. And said to him, I want to give your families presents. It was General Vance at the time, and General Vance said, well, I don't see a problem with that. That sounds great. And so they put together a mechanism where my family was working through Support Our Troops at the time to help find the families that were going to be getting these gifts, and then helping to deliver the gifts to the families. Again, my parents didn't know what they didn't know, so they kind of looked to the subject matter experts at the time to say, all right, if you say do it this way, we'll do it this way.
You recounted a story to me about sort of starting to understand the end user, about what you put into packages and what's appropriate for different communities, and not just a military community specifically, but where that military community is based out of.
So I think this is how I started to get involved in how we sort of formed new leadership in the organization. My parents were incredibly well-intended individuals. They just wanted to do right by these families. But they didn't take the time to get to know who the families were, what they might need, where they were located. And frankly, my father was so busy working on so many projects at the same time. He didn't devote. He's amazing when he devotes 100% of his attention to something. But when you devote 5% of your attention to something, you're only going to get about 5% back from that. So he started getting me involved, and there was another individual that ended up being our current CEO. We took a trip to Edmonton, to CFB Edmonton, because my parents really wanted to give out some of these gifts in person and say thank you in person. And so I went because I helped organize the trip, and I brought my current CEO, Rick Seymour, who was in the role of more of a marketing capacity for us, and sort of helping us establish our brand. And I said to him, this must be a good opportunity for us to establish our brand by going to a military base and maybe taking some photos and seeing some of the good work that we're doing. And in these packages, it was really generous gifts to the blind eye. $25 to here, and 50% off to here, and $75 to here. And the total package was probably valued at somewhere around $400 of cash gift cards in there. We went to the base, and the whole situation, my parents stood up and gave this big speech about our family and talked a lot about Together We Stand and gave some hugs, and called it a day. And it was actually Rick Seymour, who's our current CEO, who sat us down at the end of the event, because my parents were like, that went really well. And his job might have been on the line, but he had the gall to say, actually, I think that was really terrible. We should never do that again. And I heard that and thought, well, this is going to be an awkward flight home, because now I got to fire the guy. And Rick and I ended up having a few glasses of wine that night and sitting in the lobby till well into early morning because he kept trying to explain to me that we didn't know our stakeholders. We thought we were having impact, but we weren't having the impact that we were having. Do we know what an Army life is like? Does that differ from a Navy family? Does that differ from an Air Force family? If you live in Cold Lake, is your experience going to be different than somebody who lives in Halifax? And more importantly, did the families even need any of these gifts, or were they accessible to them? And his famous line is, we were being really great, but it was kind of like we were giving turkeys to vegetarians, like very well intended, but zero impact. We talk about this story all the time, but there's a frozen yogurt company in Toronto called Yogenfruz, and it's great. It's great. And every single package had $25 to Yogenfruz, except that Yogenfruz doesn't exist outside of the GTA. So the families, here we were trying to say thank you to the families, but to a certain degree, we were almost alienating them even more because we were making it so clear that we knew nothing about them. So when Rick and I took over the organization, and he tried to make me take over the organization, and I know my skills. I know what I am and what I'm not, and I'm not necessarily the CEO of an organization. I fired my father affectionately, walked into his office, said, "I love you so much, but you're fired." Hired Rick, and he convinced me that we needed to take the organization down to the studs. And our number one rule was no assumptions. We need to be vulnerable enough to strip down our egos and walk into all of these rooms and say, we know nothing about you. So why don't you teach us about you? And why don't you tell us what you need? And then we can go make that happen. And it was really a turning point for the organization.
How'd your father take getting fired?
He was great. He was great.
I was going to say, when was the last time he was fired?
Yeah, he was great. He was like, if you guys think you can do this, and the arguments we made for it, he was like, you're making total sense. Run with it. Again, he's never been an individual that was threatened by others wanting to grow. So he looked at it as a true growing opportunity for us and a potential for us to have success in the space where he could then focus his efforts on other things, and he just let us run with it.
So now you've got an adjusted vision, or maybe it's your strategy stayed the same in terms of your outlook of what you wanted to achieve, but you've now changed some of the operating principles for different outcomes. So how did you then move forward in trying to make adjustments so that what you're actually delivering with Together We Stand aligns to your long-term vision?
We did a lot of learning. And unlike this podcast where I'm chatting your ear off, we did a lot of listening. And we did a lot of encouraging individuals to tell their stories. And we learned so much along the way where we were combating our own ideas of what a military family looked like, understanding exactly what Rick said, that an Army family has a completely different experience although they're part of the military, their experience looks completely different than an Air Force family. And geography and where the bases are located obviously plays a huge role in what the family was experiencing as well. And what better to learn about this community than by going to the community? So we were determined not to stay in Toronto and come across as these Torontonians trying to come save people.
We're here to help.
I imagine, and I can't tell you the pushback we kind of got at the beginning of our journey, where we would show up and people would be like, "What do you want?" And where are the strings? And what are you trying to accomplish here? And almost a bit wary of us. And we learned so much about what the military is, what the military isn't, the families' experiences. And ultimately, the biggest takeaway was every family looks different, every experience is different, every family experiences different challenges. So we need to make sure that whatever we do, unlike some of the other, and this is not to disparage any of the other organizations because they do a lot of fine work, but the biggest challenge that we were hearing in the community is that often their unique differences were not taken into consideration when formulating programs and services. That the misnomer was, if you are a military family, you all look the same, and therefore one solution fits all. It's a one-size-all situation. So how could we formulate programs that embraced the differences and the nuances of each family? So, and I can give you 2 examples of that. The first is we completely revamped our care package program. So we actually said, what would be useful? What would you like as a gift?
Yeah.
Asking instead of just making assumptions of what people might like. Cash was obviously a big thing in terms of instead of directing the cash towards a particular establishment, having a prepaid MasterCard that would give individuals the flexibility, because one family might need their lawn mowed, the other family might want to buy pizza one night, and the other family needs to pay some bills. Mm-hmm. And then including gifts in there that were accessible online and were national distributors, so that wherever the families were, they could access them and they weren't going to be left out because they lived in Shiloh, Manitoba.
Right.
The second is our emergency fund. We said, what's the number one thing that you are lacking in your community? And we spoke to base commanders and chiefs or wing commanders. We spoke to chaplains. We spoke to privates and corporals. We spoke to MFRCs. We spoke to families. And the number one theme that we constantly heard was there was no financial support systems for acute financial emergencies in military families. There were other financial supports available through banks, through SISIP, through Support Our Troops, but those services came with either a very long wait period, significant paperwork. There were a lot of barriers to accessing that assistance. And sometimes that assistance is needed now and not 3 weeks from now. So we said, okay, great. We're just going to do it. And so now we've established a fund where we actually distribute through the chaplains, because we found that families were predominantly speaking to the chaplains when they were in need of these, when they found themselves in family emergencies. And now we can distribute funding to a family and then in crisis within a 72-hour window.
Now, when Steph says MFRC, for those who don't know, it's the Military Family Resource Center on different bases. Now you and Rick have found these different places where you can apply the resources of Together We Stand, and clearly there's a couple of themes of flexibility, mm-hmm. of agency, being able to make your decision about what's important to you and your family. How does Together We Stand then evolve going forward? Like, what are the sort of the next things that are on your on the list to achieve?
I think I can answer that in 2 parts. So the first is understanding where the military is going and understanding the needs of military families. I think that some organizations become so hard-pressed on what they do and what they don't do that they forget to adapt. So continuing to grow and learn and say, is this program still necessary, or has it become obsolete because the issues have resolved themselves, or because the pressing matters of the day no longer are in this bucket and we have to move over to a different bucket? So I think it's really playing to our strength of flexibility and adaptability and agility, and that idea of listening and learning. Part of our organization's mandate is to stay as up to date with what's happening in the world. And based on what's happening in the world, how does that affect Canada? How does that affect the role of the Canadian Armed Forces? And then how will that impact the role of the families? So staying adaptable and making sure that we change with the times. And I think the other thing is we want to be an organization that doesn't offer Band-Aid solutions. And that's been one of our mandates with our emergency fund program. Right now, when a family's in crisis, we hand out money. But why was that crisis there? And are we seeing any trends or themes? So one of the things that we've established through our program is that when a family receives funding, they do not have to self-identify. I have no idea who these families are. It's part of making sure that We maintain their integrity, that a family who's going through crisis should be able to receive funding with grace and dignity. But we do gather some non-identifying information. Is the family Army, Navy, Air Force? Are they Anglophone, Francophone? Do they have dependents? What base are they from? And more importantly, what is the funding being used for? And we kind of divide it into different buckets. Emergency housing, emergency childcare, health services, whether it be physical or mental health, emergency travel, and food security. Because we need to understand what is the need. And over the course of the past couple of years, we've really started to be able to identify some trends. We see that a lot of our funding is going towards the Army. Now, is that because the Army is the biggest profession in the organization? Or is it because of the nature of their work and the fact that they're moving so frequently as opposed to potentially the Navy that's on one coast or the other coast? We are seeing a lot of our funding going to non-commissioned members, junior non-commissioned members. We are seeing a lot of our funding going to particular bases because perhaps the geography of where they're located affects their need for funding. And we're seeing a lot of funding going towards food security issues. And so rather than just continue to put Band-Aids on those situations and having the families continue to have these issues, it's really important for us to understand what is the root cause. And in our travels, we've been so lucky to be educated on the idea that the military lifestyle is a sacrifice for military families. It's an emotional sacrifice, but it's also a financial sacrifice. That moving every 2 years to markets that may not be attractive to move to at that particular time, depending on what's going on in the world, can be really difficult financially for a family. That the rise in rent costs for homes, that having to subsidize or have the spouse not work because they have to be the childcare provider because there's no childcare available where they happen to move. The family makes sacrifices. And what are the biggest sacrifices they're making? So one of the issues that we've identified as a key role in some of the financial insecurity that we're seeing is lack of spousal employment. So we're really starting to do some work behind how can we work with Canadian businesses to understand that a spouse coming in and having to move every 2 years doesn't mean that they're not stable, that they're often overqualified for the job that they're applying for, and that they would bring tremendous value. And I think that in this day and age where remote work can be embraced, hiring spouses and educating our businesses on why we should be hiring military spouses is key to resolving some of these problems.
Is there anything else you want to talk about with Together We Stand?
I think the idea that Canadians very much take what we have, our freedoms and securities, for granted. And my biggest learning in this journey, my biggest takeaway, and it's funny because I never took my freedom for granted, my safety for granted because of my family history, but I never thought about why we have that freedom or how we have that freedom. And I think that the takeaway there that we really want to push to all Canadians who may be more naive in this is that freedom isn't free. And not all of us have to pay that price. We get to live the privileges that we live because others are paying the price for our freedom. Our individuals in uniform and their families have taken up the role of protecting us and ensuring our sovereignty and doing right by Canada across the world, and giving us a platform on the world stage. But there is a toll on that family, on those families, and they pay that price. They pay the price for our freedom every day that most Canadians take for granted.
Steph, thanks so much for taking the time to come by the house and share your family story and talk about Together We Stand. And I absolutely love the fact that it is so focused on the military family, because as I grew up in a military family, my parents both grew up in military families, so it really is something that speaks to me. The last question I'll ask is if you have any recommendations for the listener that either educates, entertains, or perhaps elevate a cause.
I love TED Talks these days because I love the ability to, or the notion of digesting some really powerful messages in a very short period of time, because who has the patience to sit and watch something for 45 minutes anymore? There's a really great TED Talk that I've wanted others to watch. It's about 15 minutes, and it talks about the way we think about charities. The individual's name is Dan Pallotta, and the name of the TED Talk is "The Way We Think About Charities is Dead Wrong." And it's this notion that when it comes to overhead costs and it comes to talent in organizations, the way that society looks at charities is that we shouldn't make an investment in people and in our tools when it comes to charities. Because at the end of the day, individuals giving to charities want to know that 100% of their dollars is going towards the cause. But ultimately, what's going to help drive towards the success of that organization? Number one, it's hiring talented, motivated individuals. And if you look at Canadian and American charities, it's almost discouraged or looked poorly upon to pay their employees well, because it's looked on as overhead. And we can take some of the smartest individuals coming out of the best schools who have the opportunity to go into the for-profit space and make millions of dollars off of creating video games that incites violence in children. Or we can have those same individuals finding a cause that can actually better the world, deal with hunger, deal with poverty, cure cancer. And that individual might make $90,000 a year. The individual making the video games could be paid $500,000 a year, donate $100,000 of that, and still be ahead of the game and not be incentivized to go work in the charitable industry where we could be bettering the lives of others. So the first is that we need to start incentivizing our talent more in all of these charitable industries, because people are having to make a choice between making a living or doing good in the world. And it's such a backwards concept to me. The other is the idea of how you can market your organization in order to promote the work you're doing, in order to get donors in the door. When you look at for-profit businesses, they spend millions and millions of dollars on advertising. Why? Because they want to get out to the broad market. If you are a charitable organization, marketing is considered overhead. And however, how do you teach your donors and how do you get to a broad audience about what it is you're trying to accomplish and the work that needs to be done and the importance of the topic if you can't speak to an audience? What's the difference? What is the difference in bringing dollars in if you are able to produce a commercial versus if you hang a flyer in a laundromat? And so it's just this very backwards thinking of how to invest in charitable organizations, because overhead is seen as a dirty word. And I just find it a very, very interesting concept of how if we were allowed to treat our charitable industry the same way we treated our for-profit industry, how much more could all of these charities thrive and do more work and better work?
Well, I am going to watch that straight away. And for listeners, check the show notes for an easy link to that video. Thanks again, Steph, for your time. And thanks for being one of our Northern Sentinels.
Thank you.
You can find information in the show notes on the Toronto Holocaust Museum, the Together We Stand Foundation, and Stephanie's recommended TED Talk, The Way We Think About Charities is Dead Wrong by Dan Pallotta. Thanks for listening to the NSP, and goodbye until next time.